Right, well, welcome. Thank you so much for coming along to support this event. For those tuning in online, and I believe I look that way, welcome. Thank you also for tuning in. I gather we have people in Australia where it's about 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, so hello to people in Australia. So I am Tom Slater, Professor of Urban Planning here at GSAPP and Director of the PhD program in Urban Planning. A couple of thank yous before we get going. First of all, I need to thank our Dean of GSAPP, Andres Hake. We are very grateful to him for his support of this event, his really enthusiastic encouragement that goes into this event. Secondly, I want to thank the wonderful Kendra Sykes, who's sitting at the back of the room here, our Director of Internal Exhibitions and Events, for truly outstanding work to make this evening possible, characterized, as always, by incredible generosity, patience, and kindness. So thank you, Kendra, for all the work that you've done. So a bit about our PhD program. So it's a vital and vibrant component of GSAPP. We recruit 3 very talented students each year from around 100 applications annually. And these students work on issues at the very cutting edge of the interdisciplinary field of urban affairs, under the guidance of 5 full-time faculty. All of these remarkable students are in some way researching questions around the theme of urban inequalities, and they're dedicated to advancing social and spatial justice in the urban context that draw their attention. Our PhD program annual lecture series is a new development. It began last year, and the idea behind it was to keep alive and to extend the extraordinary legacy of the late, great Peter Marcuse, who taught urban planning at GSAPP from 1975 to 2005. Peter is one of my predecessors in this role. He served as director of the PhD program in urban planning for over a decade during that time. So just like Peter was for his whole professional life, each annual speaker is to be a critical scholar who is deeply engaged in struggles for social justice in urban contexts. A speaker who works tirelessly and brilliantly to imagine urban worlds where the needs of people come before the interests of profit, something that Peter wrote about through his entire career. In 2010, Peter, in his much-missed manner of boiling things down to their essence in a politically useful way, he wrote, and I quote, "All research, given the way the world is today, must be critical or it is dishonest." In 2025, this seems more important than ever. And as a program, I'm sure many of you in this room know that we've really felt that, particularly what happened to one member of our program, and we send our best wishes to that student. This annual occasion is an opportunity for our students and our colleagues to meet and learn from an inspirational figure who helps us understand and explain some of the major urban challenges of our time. And my very good friend Libby Porter fits this bill very beautifully, and it's such a thrill and honor to introduce her to you this evening. So Libby is Professor and Director of the Centre for Urban Research at RMIT University in Melbourne. Quite simply, an intellectual giant in the field of urban planning and urban geography, Libby's work is concerned with land and housing justice, critical questions of urban governance, the politics of property, and how urbanization creates forms of dispossession and displacement, and what we might do to address these. A very prolific scholar, Libby is the author of many books and papers, including the foundational 2010 book, Unlearning the Colonial Cultures of Planning, which is now, quite rightly, one of the staple ingredients of any planning program with a conscience. Libby's work always tackles head-on the responsibilities of urban planners to marginalized peoples and to First Peoples sovereignty, and she has written many remarkable works that effectively invite urban planning as a field to take a look in the mirror and consider questions such as, in whose interests are we planning? What urban knowledges have been marginalized and how can they be brought to the center? Urban development for whom, against whom, and who decides? These are the kinds of questions that animate everything that Libby's work does. So Libby has always been the very model of a politically committed scholar, participating in and helping to form many grassroots collectives and initiatives to catalyze action in the face of urban injustice. Libby and I first met 17 years ago, I worked out the other day, when we were both trying to understand and explain and resist the process of gentrification in our different research contexts. Libby was doing remarkable work with tenant movements in Glasgow and Scotland who were contesting the displacement caused by the planning mechanisms that were put in place for the 2014 Commonwealth Games in that city. So Libby was learning, organising, working and writing with tenant movements and communities. The emphasis here is on the word with. Libby would never conduct research about and on, always with and alongside. Libby's work then and now is simply a glorious illustration of how gripping passion and massive integrity can be harnessed in solidarity with marginalised peoples with the goal of exposing and challenging injustice. A number of years later, I was advising a PhD student at Edinburgh working on questions of land dispossession, and that student was having some difficulties writing one key chapter of the dissertation on the meaning of land and relationships to the land among a community threatened with displacement. So I shared with that student a 2017 piece of Libby's, which was entitled Possessory Politics and the Conceit of Procedure, published in the journal Planning Theory. And I said to the student who was struggling with that chapter, I said, you need to read this and you think about how it might strengthen your argument. A few days later, the student stopped by my office, practically jumping around, eyes wide open, hair everywhere, and said not only was Libby's work going to strengthen the argument, but it opened up a whole new set of questions, which were much more exciting and much too important to ignore. But then the student said something I'll never forget, and the student said, just imagine being able to think and write like Libby Porter. I've never forgotten that. So Libby, thank you so much for coming. We're all absolutely delighted to have you here. Everyone please join me in welcoming Libby to New York City.
Thank you so much, Tom, although also not thank you because I am literally crying as you're telling these stories. What a magnificent introduction. I'm not sure all of that is deserved, but hopefully I won't disappoint you this evening. Thank you to the school, to GSAPP, to the wonderful Kendra, wherever you are now, to the wonderful tech people in the room, to the Dean for the support for this lecture, and to my dear friend Tom for the invitation. It's a really great joy and honour to be with you all. Thanks to all of you for showing up on a 6:30 p.m. Tuesday evening. That's a kind of gig that no one ever wants. And also thank you to the wonderful Peter Marcuse, who was himself an intellectual giant and extremely formative in my own thinking and particularly early academic life and ongoing. I didn't meet Peter many times, but the times that I did come into his orbit interpersonally were truly wonderful experiences. You know, when you want to meet a hero and you meet that hero and you think, wow, what a great person. And Tom fits that bill too. When I first met Tom Slater, he was a hero too. So I think these are really important ethics and practices that we bring to our work. And it's honestly a huge honour to be giving this lecture partly in his honour and the tradition of his work here. I also need to begin by positioning this platform, given this very historical moment that we're in, and the principles, and holding the principles of free critical academic inquiry and public scholarship so closely as I do, and I know that this program does as well. And I want to share with you and stand alongside you our concern, which we share all around the world, about protecting these basic values and principles of freedom of academic inquiry. University campuses, which we know and love, and you have a very beautiful one here, should be sanctuary spaces for all students and staff. They should be grounded in basic human values of respect and care and love. They have a special responsibility, universities as institutions, I think, to uphold those principles and provide care and protection for everyone, especially those most at risk, and defend those principles with courage and integrity. That's, after all, what we're here to do, yeah? To defend those principles with courage and integrity. And so I've taken up this particular platform today in a slightly awkward moment, I think, and I want to just frame that with a great deal of care and respect for everyone here and for this this place and for the people who aren't in this room, and to send our deepest respects to those people, and particularly to Ranjini, and to make this platform one from a political stance of occupation. And I acknowledge that having a platform like this one is a great privilege, right? It's not just a privilege to be able to travel around the world and do those things. It's a privilege to be able to speak and to be perhaps listened to and thought with along the way. And all privileges in all of our work, no matter what privilege we occupy, brings responsibilities. And they're all already political, no matter what occupation we're taking. And occupation is, of course, its own loaded terms. It freights lots of politics, the word occupation, so I don't use it lightly here. Gaza is under siege. Palestinians are under occupation. Many people around the world are under occupation. So I want to honour the Palestinian people, their struggle for justice and home, for every peoples out there in the world who are struggling for justice and home, and doing that in forms of liberatory politics that are in tune with the ways that we occupy the world together, and come from and seek home and place together. I come from a place that is occupied under a settler-colonial regime. This picture is taken just down the road from where I live. And that's a regime from which I benefit. And here we are speaking with each other in a place that has been under a structurally similar occupation for more than 400 years. And what I didn't know, but Tom just told me about 10 minutes ago, is that, of course, I don't know how I didn't notice this, but the name Columbia University is, of course, very colonial. So all of this reminds us that there is no comfortable, innocent place for any one of us to stand. Doesn't matter who we are or where we are. There is nowhere outside of history. There is no view from nowhere. And it's only from these necessarily uncomfortable emplacements inside profound contradictions that we can begin to grapple with questions of land and home, belonging and futures, and what I'm going to describe to you tonight as the structural ruination of planning for land and housing, which is a pretty big claim, so I'll try and unpack it a bit. So the purpose of my lecture tonight is to bring some stories from the place I call home, which is Melbourne in so-called Australia, to grapple with the particular problem of demanding housing justice through planning systems under conditions of occupation. I want to carefully examine what's really at stake when we look to planning and housing as solutions, as sort of salves for the depredations of colonial capitalist urbanisation, and examine what new violences are brought into being when we do so, and where else we might turn to look for other kinds of liberatory politics. But I want to begin by starting with a little story that starts from here, this place, as a kind of way into that. So last month, when Trump first said out loud his rather demonic vision for a Gaza stripped of the Palestinian people and rebuilt with luxury golf resorts, I was doom scrolling, as one does, news and opinion pieces on the train on the way home from work. Now, the imagination of Gaza as a real estate development site is not new. He hadn't actually said anything new in that sense, but it was a particularly accelerated moment, a really pointed moment that to me revealed something very important, because as I'm doom scrolling and reading Guardian pieces and things, as one might expect, I tripped over an opinion piece in The Guardian that presented this very strident critique of that horrifying statement that he made, and it really brought me up short. And it said this: Mr. Trump is treating a war zone at the centre of one of the world's most intractable conflicts as if it were a patch of derelict Manhattan real estate. As if it were a patch of derelict Manhattan real estate. So here where we stand right now, as I've learned with Lenape scholar Joanne Barker, properly known as Mannahatta, a Lenape place known and cherished and sustained by Lenape peoples and part of a wider Lenape territory. Barker teaches us that Mannahatta, which I actually might be mispronouncing and call me up on it if I am, is a Lenape word that I understand means island of many hills. I imagine it may have other meanings as well. And that Lenape governance is, to quote Barker, a decentralised set of polities based on matrilineal values of shared governance across what are now the states of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania and Delaware, end quote. The defrauding of the Lenape by an Englishman working for the Dutch West Indies Company who misrepresented an agreement worth around $24, I understand, as if it were a sale, is doubly violent because I understand that same colonial agent mistranslated the name to Manhattan. So names matter. And in this context, I want to name, and in doing so pay deep respect and abiding love to the Lenape, Canarsie, Delaware tribes people whose practices and knowledge systems have created and sustained this place where we meet right now, even inside such an artificial space as this one. And they continue to endure despite so many centuries of occupation. Now, my purpose in drawing attention to this very small and seemingly very common sense quote from a newspaper column is to think with and through lines of connection between geographies and histories of the urban. But before I get to that, I just want to make some important asterisks of kind of qualification. So I've just pulled focus, right, from Gaza to Manhattan, or Melbourne for that matter, and what I don't want to do is perform a kind of too easy deflection from or equivalence with the ongoing horror of genocide. I'm not trying to pivot attention away from Gaza towards a less fresh or less obviously suppurating colonial wound, because that would be horrific, right? But instead, I'm acknowledging that what I have to talk about is not from and about Gaza, because that's not my story, it's not my place to do so, but it is nonetheless deeply connected to it. And here I'm taking my cue and I'm taught very deeply by the practice of First Nations people in Australia, whose solidarity with Palestinian liberation has been unyielding and remains clear-eyed and unflinching. I heard recently Yamachi scholar Crystal McKinnon, who's an amazing writer and thinker, say, if we're not holding every struggle together, then we're not holding any struggle at all. And this seems an especially pertinent insight for this current moment across so many vectors of injustice. So what I'm really seeking to lift up in saying this is understanding these deep interconnections, right? Not the sameness, but the interconnection between grave injustice. And that also means thinking with the geographical and social and historical connections through which systems of colonial violence bind places together, and particularly bind the urban together. So the lands that I and my family come from and occupy in so-called Australia are the country, and that's capital C, so it means the sentient place, it is a life world, of multiple nations of First Peoples. And I acknowledge and pay my deep respects to the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people, the Bunurong or Bunurong people of the wider Kulin Nation, on whose territory I live, and that territory is now largely built up and over by the metropolis that we now know as Melbourne. So to speak about, on, from colonial settings, but to be located like me, a settler, an uninvited guest, but nonetheless welcomed, carries very precise accountabilities. And one of those accountabilities is to stay with the fact of enduring Wurundjeri, Bunurong and Bunurong sovereignties, and insist that this fact should trouble any common sense assumption we might arrive at, any normalised idea about place, land and home. And that has been really the sort of central guiding force of my work for 25 years. So the Guardian's statement, as if it were a vacant Manhattan lot, is made possible by what Joanne Barker calls a specific politics of epistemology, one that has produced and normalised a now irrelevant Indian, to paraphrase Barker's words. And that comment provides insight into one of the myths that's central to the machinery of settler coloniality. And that myth is this, that land is a surface on which the imagination of new orders can be endlessly imposed, once that land is cleared of the physical, legal and human encumbrances which have been defined as such, as encumbrances, by the racist logic that is the main oxygen supply of colonialism. After all, the only thing that a Lenape person, a Wurundjeri person, a Palestinian has to do to get in the way is to stay home. The intractable conflict that created a war zone here, a war zone in Melbourne, has been entirely faded from view, obscured by centuries of epistemic violence that creates a fundamental break in our geographical and historical understanding. And that break is what the Guardian's comment rests upon, that kind of common sense utterance. Because once cleared and reorganised in the image of its own name, settler colonial space comes to appear settled. Property and planning have always been central to this task, central to operationalising this myth and sustaining the sensibility of settled space. Property instantiated through settler colonialism is a racial regime. It works in highly specific ways to produce and affirm the nation-state's ownership and control. And this is an image made in the early years of Melbourne's colonisation, and you can see the laying out of property on top of Wurundjeri land. This is inherently violent by definition because it imposes an entire ecology of ownership and extraction on an existing socio-ecological order and geography. And then what it does is it creates categories based on racial hierarchies of who can be an owner, who can be propertyless, and who can be property. And here I'm referencing, of course, the important work of legal scholar Cheryl Harris and Gowanpool scholar Aileen Morton-Robinson. So the categories of public land and private land, with which in planning we're so familiar, both fall into this property ecology, a colonial property ecology. As the mechanism through which land use is controlled and organised and ordered, planning is essential to sustaining this racial regime of property and the creation of the image and function of settled space. And so we are familiar with what that looks like in historical and contemporary terms. So planning functions to hold in place, to kind of bolt into the territory, an enactment of the relationship between property ownership, public land, and the extraction of wealth through development. Think of the visual manifestation of white possession. This is a quote from Aileen Morton-Robinson, which describes it very well here. So it's in this contemporary practice that planning functions to hold in place these kind of norms of the public good as we often think about them. They arrange according to the logics of property, the services and infrastructure of human settlement based on this idea, this cultural norm of land as a flat plain, well, maybe with topography, but nonetheless a surface, empty until filled with an activity or a use that looks like its own criteria, right? And operationalised every day through zoning and development decisions and all those things that we think are familiar as planners. Urban strategies imagine future settlement patterns that assume settler occupation on its own terms on into the future. By definition, planning requires and imagines blank slates, empty lands. It's the handmaiden to the settler colonial drive of elimination. Sustaining property as a racial regime is a task that planning continues to uphold on and into the future. It's the literal reality that we inhabit today. We only need to look around. So the city I call home, pictured here, let's come there now, and I'll say a little more about, it's a wonderful city, Melbourne, do come and visit. Melbourne, more properly known, and more properly named as either Naarm, which is the Woiwurrung and Bunurong word for the large bay around which Melbourne curls. You can see it off in the distance in the slide there. Or Birrarunga, lands of the Birrarung, which is the major river on which the city sits, which you can see snaking through the city centre here. I want you to notice how the proper names for the place I call home express relationships to water, which you can see here in this image. It was these water bodies that carried the boats that brought colonial invaders, including two competing syndicates, one led by John Fawkner and one led by John Batman with his accomplice John Helder Wedge. Apparently every English coloniser was called John, but anyway. All the Johns eventually sailed across the strait from what is now called Tasmania and found the entrance of the Birrarung and sailed up or rowed up to the river in around 1835 to this natural weir that's pictured rather awkwardly here. And this weir separated the brackish water that was on the coastal side of the river from the purer water, the fresh water up the river. And they got off the boats and established a town. And from this place, what was unleashed was one of the swiftest and most devastating dispossessions in British imperial history. More than 23 million hectares of land was violently stolen in a very short space of time from the 38 nations of First Peoples, and their land, skies and waters of all those nations was fundamentally transformed. The population of First Peoples was brought near to collapse as the material, discursive, legal and imaginative infrastructure of what we now call the state of Victoria was forced into place. Now, a pivotal manoeuvre in that story was a so-called treaty. I have to use scare quotes here. And that treaty was struck by John Batman, one of the Johns. Batman was a syphilitic, mass-murdering Englishman, just stating facts, who tried to pass off a document that he likely fabricated as confirmation of the sale of a vast area of land tried to pass it off that was signed by Woiwurrung and Bunurong nations to him. So the Batman Treaty actually mirrors closely the experience here in Mannahatta, and what unfolded was, of course, a gigantic fraud. Documents like Batman's Treaty or the fraud that was committed here against Lenape people have imperial afterlives, what Seneca scholar Mishwana Goman has called carrying the weight of the X mark. It wasn't an X mark in this document, but nonetheless, the idea is the same. The colonial government, who at the time had been reluctant to recognise settlement in what was then the colony of New South Wales, beyond its initial what was called limits of location around Sydney, they were kind of forced to contend with what Batman and all the Johns had done, right? And they moved against Batman's claim. But they didn't do so to recognise Indigenous rights, even though they realised that there were people here. But what they did was they shored up the British Crown's claim to territory it did not yet fully possess. Such is the foundations of the structural ruination of planning for land and housing in my city. So I just want to say a little bit more here about what I do and don't mean by structurally ruined. So ruins and ruination have been an area of fertile thinking in urban geography, in aesthetics and studies of imperialism of late. I'm not talking about the colony as a site of ruination or gesturing toward thinking of like the detritus of former social orders to which colonialism or capitalism has kind of laid waste. And I'm not trying to point to relics that give glimpses of some kind of social order that's now been lost, that coloniality has kind of thrust into a state of decay. I'm not talking about ruins as sites, physical or metaphorical, from which new possibilities can spring. There are, of course, profound losses, harm, states of injury, and endings of worlds under settler colonial urbanism, that is without doubt. But that would elide the truth of Indigenous, Black, and other oppressed lives living on through, whether in overt resistance or quiet refusal. So we have to take care with the settler colonial framing, I think, when it's used only as an analytic, it can start to make the world look like its desire for elimination has already been achieved. So we have to take a lot of care with that framework, and that's not what I mean. Instead, I'm using structural ruination as a sharper analytic for grappling with the reality of planning as an imperial formation. So this is a quote from Anne Stoller, who is here in the city. She conceptualises ruination and imperial formation as both processual, yeah? So she describes them as vibrantly violent verbs, in her words. This to me is very useful conceptually and epistemologically because it helps us analyse how imperial formations endure, what work they do in the world, and helps us pay attention to what Stoller calls here the political life of imperial debris. So to explore this further, I want to return to Batman's supposed treaty and the political life of that particular piece of imperial debris. And here I really want to acknowledge the work of my two brilliant colleagues, David Kelly and Priya Kunjan. Together we've recently published some work that I'm going to draw from here, and that's very much their work as well. So there's credible evidence that the location at which Batman signed this, well, I'm not even going to say signed a treaty, committed this infamous fraud, occurred on the banks of a small creek called the Merry Creek. It's an important tributary of the Birrarung on Wurundjeri land. And here's a picture that's often used and is in the State Library in Victoria, in Melbourne, depicting this momentous event. So today, that site is in the inner city neighbourhood of Northcote. It's just a short distance from where I live. And close by to this site is an urban housing site. In fact, this photo was taken from it by my colleague David. And I'll refer to this site of urban housing as Walker Street. And it references a small public housing estate that up until a few years ago housed 86 families in a very well located inner neighbourhood next to the creek. Back in 2018, public housing residents at Walker Street received a letter telling them kind of what they already knew, which was that their estate was old and run down and wasn't really no longer fit for purpose. But instead of repairing what the tenants had been asking for years to get fixed, the letter from the Victorian government said their homes would be redeveloped as part of what was called then the Public Housing Renewal Program. This targeted another 10 inner city public housing, kind of mid-rise estates about this high, and advanced a real estate model using public-private partnerships, which were founded in kind of increasingly tricky, non-transparent financial models to bring market housing to each site and transfer the public housing tenancies to a new breed of landlord that we're noticing arrive in Australia, called a community housing provider, a not-for-profit provider of social housing. So the redevelopment at Walker Street, the buildings were demolished, obviously, and the community displaced. And the redevelopment is almost finished, close to completion. It replaced those 86 public housing dwellings with 151 private market apartments, all of which, of course, get the really nice creek frontage. And all of the residents, the previous residents, were relocated. And about 99 or so community housing social units that are clustered in one building on the least attractive, noisiest corner of the site. The community was broken up with little prospect, really meaningful prospect of return. So how should we understand what has happened on this site, very close to this founding moment of Melbourne? I think to understand this program, we need to bring its roots more clearly into view. So like all Australian cities and towns, much like here, I think, maybe like in your context, the housing ecology, if you like, the housing system is dominated by what is constantly referred to as the Great Australian Dream. I think this is the same here, right? The Great American Dream of home ownership, which since invasion has been the dominant tenure in the housing ecology. More generally, housing is seen in Australia as a private market affair. You buy your housing yourself in the private market. Public housing has always been a tiny fraction of the housing system, never more than around 5% kind of in its heyday in the 1960s. And public housing in Melbourne is also the result of a very extensive slum clearance program that ran in the post-war period, and the interwar period from the 1930s through to the 1950s, including at Walker Street, actually. Our situation today is much as you would expect. It would be very familiar. Skyrocketing house and land prices, fueled by a very regressive taxation system in Australia that rewards investors and landlords. We have plummeting real wages, underemployment, and that all means, of course, that a much larger proportion of people are renting because there's no other alternative, mostly in the private market, and almost all of them are in rental stress. The wait list for public housing is growing rapidly. In Victoria, it now sits at more than 110,000 people. And they're just the people who've put their hand up and said, I'm in deep trouble and need public housing. Those that have managed to purchase in lower income brackets are often severely stretched by mortgage debt. They're working second jobs, commuting long distances in a city that has failed to adequately provide sensible public transport or mixed neighbourhoods and continues to build paddock after paddock of houses on the urban fringe. So Australian society is kind of steeped in this cultural orientation to land and housing as assets that you own to extract wealth from and secure your and your children's futures. So let's just look at the way that housing is conceived. It should be a familiar image because I think it's quite widely used around the world. The housing continuum. We should read this visual as diagramming a fully normalised and cultural and economic structure around land and housing. So full personhood is attainable only by achieving the status at this end of this continuum, private home ownership. Down the other end, and in fact not even mentioned on this, is homelessness, so sleeping on the street, your home is the street. And just adjacent to that and sort of crisis accommodation is public housing. So public housing is conceived as a kind of ambulance service. It picks some people up out of desperate situations and shelters them, but only under the conditions that it's conceived as being on a journey towards something better, that you'll move from public housing possibly into community provided affordable housing, possibly then into private rental and so on until you achieve full personhood by becoming a private landowner. This kind of diagramming is to be found sitting underneath, unacknowledged because it is so fully normalised, in every public debate, every policy discourse, every family conversation around a barbecue. All of what I've just described stems from an understanding of the land relationship as one of extractive possessive property, instantiated through settler colonialism, but then obscured from view. All of it is just hiding in plain sight. So let's go back to Walker Street. The creation of the Walker Street site, as I now think of it anyway, began obviously at Batman's time, but here's a picture of it from the mid-1800s, 1853, I think it is. It's a perfectly ordinary looking map, if somewhat historical, so familiar as to be unremarkable, I suppose, in planning and urban studies. But think of this. This map was made 18 years after Batman's little fraud. What does it take to create the conditions to make a map like this 18 years after Batman had stood just across on the Merry Creek there and done what he did? Well, one of the institutions it requires is the organisation of land into measurable parcels that enable extraction, property and title. And it requires narrating a kind of what I call a temporal and legal distance from that original dispossession to make it look like this site is now settled. There's nothing more to see here. It's everyone's erased. And it turns out that title, and this is the work very much that David and Priya and I have been doing, it turns out that title documents are pretty interesting places to look to see how that instrument works in this kind of re-narration of place and belonging on settler terms. So we went looking in the archives for all the titles that made up that little site that is in the orange box there, the orange circle. And we found all of them, actually. It was very interesting. And when we read them, particularly from the top on the right-hand side, which is like the second page in old-fashioned titles, they don't appear quite so much like this anymore in the modern versions. We can kind of read them as a kind of historical archive of ownership, right? But they also can be read, I think, as a register of the ongoingness of colonialism, the kind of constant exchange, deploying dispossession over and over again as the spoils of stolen land are continuously cycled through this property ecology. And they're cycling from the Crown through private hands and eventually back to the Crown again in this red stamp on the side, which is under the slum clearance program, returning all of these private titles to the hands of the state government to be built as public housing and the whole of the site was then organised into one title. So regardless of the owner being a private individual, listed here, or a public agency, the red stamp, the persistent mechanism through which settler colonial society organises its relationship with First Peoples is here, but as I said before, kind of hidden in plain sight. And I would like to use this vantage point to try and read two things. First is this deliberate evisceration of public housing. And second is the politics that then is incited by that evisceration to address the question of housing justice. Because actually they stem from the same, what Michele Lancioni would call rotten substratum of home, of a deeply problematic understanding of what home is. And so I want to kind of work our way through that. Bear with me while I do that. Okay, so the decline of public housing stems from, as I've mentioned before, a strategic and sustained underinvestment in the existing stock. Virtually no new public housing built in Victoria for a long time, and all of what has been there has been kind of transferred to these community housing providers that I mentioned earlier. It's that context for an announcement that our then state premier Daniel Andrews, made in September 2023. He'd apparently not spoken to any of his colleagues in Cabinet, nor did he notify the more than 10,000 people that were about to be impacted, when he stood on top of an already emptied public housing tower alongside the Australian Prime Minister and announced that he would demolish all of the remaining 44 public housing high-rise towers spread across Melbourne and redevelop them as a mix of private and social housing. So this was the next iteration of the public housing renewal program that we'd seen happen at Walker Street, but now massively accelerated. The decision was justified in the same way. The buildings are run down, it's not fit for purpose. Isn't it terrible that we let poor people, live in these conditions? Yes, of course it is, so let's not do that. But it's the product, of course, of decades of sustained disinvestment by that state government, who is the landlord and owner of these buildings, and they'd ignored the requests of residents for several years to do urgent maintenance and upgrades. So this plan represents the evisceration of public housing in Victoria. Here's the geography of them shown on the map. So notice their good position in the inner areas of the city. They're very well located for public transport. They're next to public open space. They're very well serviced by all of the things that urban communities need. And of course, because of all of that and because of that little phenomenon called gentrification, their land value is now very high. And they house more than 10,000 people, all of whom will be displaced from those communities. The redevelopment model is entirely real estate driven. It seeks to densify the sites with mostly private market housing and a smattering of affordable, but we don't know how they'll make it so, and a component of social housing run by community housing organisations. So what we have here is the full restructure of the social geography of Melbourne. And I mentioned earlier that public housing is the result of a substantial slum clearance program in the post-war period. And it was built under racial logics to serve the white working class. But since the 1970s in particular, it has become home to several important waves of new migrants, people seeking asylum and so on, from Southeast Asia, from Africa and the Middle East. And in the three towers that have got the crosshairs on them for the first round of demolition, they're in North Melbourne and Flemington, kind of inner west and inner north. Those communities are predominantly from the Horn of Africa and Vietnam. It's no coincidence that those are the very same towers that were subjected to a very lengthy and very hard lockdown at the height of the pandemic, subjected to an intensification of already existing over-policing, control of movement and heavy state surveillance. So people were actually locked in their buildings as a public health measure, scare quotes intended, during COVID and not allowed out, some for 5 days and some for nearly 2 weeks. The impacts of the hard lockdowns on these communities, their mental and physical health and their social connection was very real and is ongoing. And enacting that harm, the Victorian government was found by the Ombudsman to have breached the human rights of all of those families and communities in so doing. The towers are also extremely significant places for Aboriginal communities in Melbourne and beyond, particularly because during this assimilation era of Australian history, which was an era of profound harm to Indigenous people, an era of child removals, the closing of missions, and yet more rounds of dispersal and kind of the pushing of people away from different places. So from the 1960s onward, Aboriginal people often had to move to Melbourne to find work, connect to services and find family after decades of forced disconnection. Public housing often became home, and the towers in Fitzroy and Collingwood in particular, just sort of further to the north, were especially significant for many. And during the 1970s, amid a clear physical and mental health crisis among Aboriginal communities, a group of mostly Aboriginal women established what would become and remains the Victorian Aboriginal Health Service. And this came amid a vitally important time also of sort of staunch land rights activism across the country. There were many connections actually between the Black Power movement in Australia and the Black Power movement here, lots of cross-fertilisation of ideas. And one of the women who established the health service was Auntie Alma Thorpe, a proud Gunditjmara activist in her own words. And the quotes here on this slide next to this rather grainy photograph, this is the building that was the health service in its heyday. It's located in Fitzroy, right across from one of the towers that Andrews wants to demolish. And these words that Auntie Alma is saying here are given in her testimony to the Yurruk Truth and Justice Commission, which is an absolutely historic first of its kind of truth-telling in Australia, and part of the contemporary treaty process that is currently underway in Victoria. And it's held a series of inquiries into the truth of injustices experienced by First Peoples around issues like children in the justice system, over-incarceration of First Peoples, poor health outcomes, and land dispossession and racism. So Arnie Alma was speaking to Yuruk as a respected elder and community activist. And I want you to note in her words here what she's saying about home. She refers to the health service and it became known in the community as a home away from home. So if you couldn't be at home, you couldn't be on your own country perhaps, or you were disconnected from kin and family, you could nonetheless find home at the Aboriginal Health Service. So it became home to many people. And this is home not defined by tenure or shelter provisioning or four walls, but home defined as a place of safety and connection, of self-determination, supported by what I read in Auntie Alma's words and the rest of her very beautiful testimony, as a radical politics of love. In the second quote here, Auntie Alma's speaking about some of the recent shift away from that politics, but the central importance of holding on to the fact of unceded Indigenous sovereignty. And she says, this is our country, we don't have to beg for anything. So it's not innocent then that the evisceration of public housing is occurring in places that for generations have been the site of this kind of activism. It's not innocent that the evisceration of public housing is occurring as the numbers of refugees and migrants arriving into public housing is increasing. It's not innocent that the towers subjected to the first round of displacement and demolition are important Black and Asian neighbourhoods who've built up substantial community infrastructures around them. The demolition of towers is a class and racial remake. Now, there's been a big, significant groundswell of concern and activation with several groups of long-standing public housing advocates, newer alliances of tenants and neighbours advocating for public housing, including First Nations people. Many of us, including myself, have become active in advocacy and campaign work. Even as the public housing renewal program got underway, we got active. One such group established, which I was involved in as well, and many other colleagues, is the Save Public Housing Collective. It was an attempt to bring several local campaigns together. And I might also mention another form of advocacy has been the launching of a class action in the Supreme Court by residents of those towers that were under the hard lockdown that had taken their case to the Ombudsman as well. They are some feisty warrior-like communities. That action is still underway. The final hearing was last week and we're waiting for the court decision. So these and all sorts of other forms of advocacy and grassroots campaigns, they're tremendously important. And they rest their claims. I rest my claims very frequently. These are words I've probably written actually for this particular fight for housing justice. They rest their claims on two key demands. One is to build more, expand and support public housing, right? So we want more and we want better. And we make that argument to a settler state that from the perspective of Indigenous sovereignty-never-ceded is both illegitimate and a primary beneficiary of that dispossession. And then we try and defend the publicness of public housing as if public was a category that needed no further definition. So we find ourselves having to defend the institution of public housing despite it being a site of state-led violence and surveillance of racialised and marginalised populations. And we have to argue for different models of shelter provisioning as if providing shelter was the end goal for housing justice and liberation, when we all know that shelter alone is not what makes home. We have to defend housing, as Peter Marcuse wrote about so beautifully. So what I'm saying is that the politics that's compelled by an attack on public housing and low-income communities, too often in a settler colony, only becomes a claim directed to the settler state to redistribute its stolen loot in a form that reaffirms the drive to elimination and the logic of extraction. So urban struggle under such conditions is only ever a request for better redistribution or more participation. So what such politics leaves untouched is what Jodie Bird teaches us in this important quote, that the original colonisation of Indigenous lands remains unassailable, natural, rational, hidden in plain sight, to paraphrase her words, and necessary as the condition of possibility of all other dispossessions to come. So the imposition of property and planning that we talked about before as the mechanisms to order land, housing and belonging instantiate the condition of possibility for all manner of other dispossessions. If we understand that land, as Patrick Wolfe once taught us, is the irreducible element of the settler-colonial relation, and it's in the hothouse of colonialism and imperialism where property is incubated as a regime to subordinate populations deemed displaceable and the earth itself to the relentless pursuit of capital accumulation, then we understand that that's what drives ecocide and genocide. And that's what I mean by planning for land and housing is structurally ruined. So, back to thinking about that concept of structural ruin. We talked before about the imperial formation of planning with land at its centre, and more accurately, as Stoller describes, a relation of force that's already harbouring political forms that are, and to quote her, violences of disenfranchisement, but shorn of their status as imperial entailments and that go by other names, hidden in plain sight. So housing provisioning and land use organisation in contemporary cities like New York and Melbourne have been shorn of their status as imperial entailments. They are no longer recognisably colonial frontiers. They simply look like what they produce. Urban landscapes organised through common sense categories that we all accept. Mobility patterns, desire lines, familiar contours of class struggle in land. They might be classified as a vacant lot or a public open space or a residential site or commercial districts. But if we think from the position that we would learn from, say, Arnie Alma Thorpe, of sovereignty-never-ceded, such formations are still and always foretelling the discarding, abandonment and abnegation of certain bodies and placements there, the condition of possibility for all other dispossessions still to come. They rest on what scholar Max Libby would name as a now unquestioned and unproblematized access to Indigenous land. So the structure of the underlying land relation hasn't changed, just the mechanism through which it occurs. And here I want to draw on the very important work of Dene scholar Glenn Coulthard to help us think with this, because his work excavates this very important shift in what's occurring in his study of what he calls the liberal politics of recognition. If you haven't read his work, I would highly recommend it. It's a politics that Coulthard states, and I'm quoting him, promises to reproduce the very configurations of colonial power that Indigenous demands for recognition have historically sought to transcend, end quote. And all of that occurs not by overt imperial force, like we might see in Gaza, but under what, to quote Max Libby, identifies as good intentions and even good deeds. So what we have is not a change in the structure of the underlying land relation, but a shift in the mechanism of how it occurs. So to see how this works, we can go back to Walker Street and the way that that site is being remade under this liberal politics of recognition. So in 2006, a very important amendment was made to the planning system in Victoria to include protection of, so-called, of Aboriginal heritage as part of planning decision-making processes. And what it does is it establishes registered Aboriginal parties, recognisable entities to the state that should own and have a say about their own heritage, which absolutely they should, and fits them into the planning system as kind of statutory consultees that development decisions have to take into consideration under certain circumstances, any impacts on their cultural heritage of that development. And so at Walker Street, what we discovered when we ran the planning property report for the new site for the redevelopment is, of course, the naming of the organisation that now represents Wurundjeri Woiwurrung, the traditional owners' interests, as a statutory body for notification of development plans. So let's think about what we've got here. We've got an important place, Walker Street, situated in relationship to the living veins of Wurundjeri country on the side of the Merri, feeding into the Birrarung, that has been continuously stewarded over several thousands of generations of Wurundjeri law and governance, and which have witnessed successive rounds of unhoming, first through Batman's fraud, then through the instantiation of colonial governance, and the doubling down and capitalisation on that initial fraud through exchanges of property. Later, through successive rounds of housing impoverishment, creating slums, a state-driven slum clearance to create public housing, to now erase that public housing, and doing so, all of that, through a planning system that now names the first people first dispossessed, but in a way that is structurally incapable of joining all the dots between all of these events in any meaningful way. None of this can be addressed through a simple and simplistic politics of inclusion. It's not an omission that can be redressed through recognition, right? Liberal politics of recognition, because that would just fail to propose anything different at all from the terms of settlement. Stakeholder engagement, calls for redistribution, recognition of Indigenous cultural heritage. These are the norms of the contemporary planning language in the place that I call home. And they are each bound into what Sandy Grand calls a limited and precarious equality predicated on the elimination of the native. So why does all of this matter? Shouldn't we just let it go, Libby? Why hark back to a form of land relationship that seems long ago expunged, completely built over by concrete and steel, so totally contained in colonial planning and the racial regime of property? What would be the alternative anyway? We can't go back to Indigenous ways of living. I'm hoping you can hear the irony in my voice, right? These are the kinds of comments that Indigenous scholars particularly and First Peoples often have to field, not usually from the right wing, sometimes from the right wing, usually from the liberal left-leaning progressives who want to do engagement but ultimately don't want to give anything up. And they're often the kinds of questions I get in forums possibly like this one, so don't ask me one of those today. The reason it matters is quite simply because all our lives depend on it. All of us are caught in racial colonial capitalism and the will toward elimination. It's just that some people are in its teeth and some people are its teeth. But teeth that are constantly chewing on things they shouldn't eventually rot. And it's possible, I think, to see this playing out today in manifestations of toxic cultures, gaslighting, and the deliberate weaponising of disinformation. So thinking with structural ruin helps us understand this landscape. It's a deliberately abolitionist orientation that I'm taking. Settler states and liberal orders are not sites of liberation and justice. The politics that compel intellectual and political investment in them are caught, sutured into sites of structural ruin. And I think this is even more important at this moment in the midst of this direct attack on so-called liberal values of diversity, inclusion, free speech, equity. We find ourselves compelled to defend liberal colonial institutions like universities, equity models that have long been locations of profound epistemic violence. So I refuse to defend equality, diversity, equity and inclusion or academic freedoms when, someone will take that out of context I'm sure, when these are articulated and practiced as forms of expulsion, or when such principles simply operate, as Sara Ahmed would teach us, as non-performative obfuscations in the service of liberal institutions. W.E.B. Du Bois would teach us that the redistribution of prosperity has its roots in imperial exploitation. So now more than ever, we have to hold those roots in view and ensure they inform our analysis, avoiding, indeed refusing the seduction to fight simply for the right to find a more equitable distribution of the spoils of imperial exploitation. The too easy invocation of Mannahatta as a place already cleared, vacant and awaiting development is linked structurally and discursively to the all too common sense move that housing movements make, that I have made in my own work in Naam Birarunga, to defend a public in housing land and democratic planning, as if these were uncomplicated by the histories that even make them possible. the source of liberation we will not find in better planning processes, improved zoning, more inclusive planning, greater stakeholder engagement, or more just redistribution. Instead, the better question is the one that the wonderful Brenna Bandar has so eloquently posed. How do we resist contemporary forms of dispossession without replicating logics of appropriation and possessiveness that rely upon racial regimes for their sustenance? How do we do that? The answer is already here, and it always has been. It's not to perpetuate those racial regimes, but to follow into the future those who hold the knowledge and practice of systems that are grounded in normativities of generative, loving attachment. In their wonderful work in the Super Futures Haunt Collective, Moral Tuck and others remind us that the opposite of dispossession is not possession. It is not accumulation. It is unforgetting. It is mattering. So what might that mean for our practice as urban scholars and practitioners, or even just simply as people inhabiting the planet? Unforgetting, I think, invites us to turn humbly and with grace toward the methodologies and practices of reciprocal relationships that Indigenous, Black and enslaved lives under all kinds of imperialistic violences have long made manifest. Lives lived on with abundant joy, even in the teeth of empire, to quote Mohawk scholar Audra Simpson. Anishinaabe scholar Leanne Simpson teaches us that, of course, it is possible to generatively refuse the settler state as a site of liberation and the logics of property as the locus of meaningful rights, right? And it's possible to do so because it's already being done and it always has been. Auntie Alma Thorpe teaches us the same thing by her life lived in relationship with this radical politics of love, inclusion and home. Insisting on this as the possibility is to continue an essential practice of unforgetting and unlearning. Mattering, I read, as resonant with what Darrumbal and South Sea Islander scholar, the wonderful Amy McQuire, calls presencing, capital P. She documents the presence of Aboriginal women who've been disappeared by the colonial state. McQuire's methodology shows us how to refuse damage-centred narratives and discourses of deficit and turn toward what her wonderful colleague, Mununjali scholar Chelsea Wadago, calls the beauty, joy and justice within Black knowing and Black life. Arnie Alma lives this model in building the Victorian Aboriginal Health Service in Fitzroy. This is a mural from just down the road that speaks to the importance of this place. It's a presencing, a mattering of sovereign being in the world that comes directly from the law and governance of that place and from the relationship between its people. It's oriented neither to the extraction of profit nor to the accumulation of the primitive, nor was it oriented toward begging for scraps of recognition from a state whose very existence is rooted in the drive to elimination. What Arnie Alma describes and practices is an articulation of home and belonging known otherwise, of organising relations of radical love across social geographies, a form of governance and deep knowing from and of place. I think mattering invites us into an understanding that this place, my place, has been known this way always. If we define the urban as a place of dense sociality and people-place relationships, right, rather than worrying so much about buildings and desire lines, then the urbanness of places like Mannahatta, Naarm, possibly even Gaza, long predate the arrival of settlers. Mattering and presencing asks us to look otherwise, not only at the violent logics of settler-colonialism, which I have spent a lot of time doing tonight, I appreciate, but at what is already present, surviving and mattering in the face of it all. So I think this will mean, for our work together collectively, making the links analytically, conceptually and politically in all of the chains of dispossessory and possessive regimes. It will mean connecting housing justice struggles to liberatory modes of being at home that already exist. So coming into relationship with a law of responsibility rather than a law of extraction and bundles of exclusionary rights invites us toward methodologies for living in good relation. What scholar Mishwana Goman says are relations of non-domination, relations of love. It asks us as planning researchers and practitioners, I think, to accept the generous invitation to follow Indigenous sovereignty into the future. Thank you.
Libby, thank you.
Hello, I do.
I've scribbled a few notes here, and I'm glad this has been recorded because I'm going to be watching it many times. Thank you so much. And it actually says on the ticket that I'm going to give a response. I'm not really sure how to do that, but I do want to kick us off with a question, and then I'll invite you to ask questions as well. When I do so, if you could wait until you're given the microphone, because obviously the people who are watching online won't be able to hear you until you have the microphone. So, right, this is a not very well put together question, and it's mainly because my head is spinning, and there's many things here which I hope I can articulate into something. So I was struck by the certificate of title that you showed, the documents. And then I was struck by the fact that you were showing us maps, and these maps seem to be the instruments of uninvited guests, right? So the symbolic violence that's represented in the mapping, in the certificates, and in the various other things that you showed us. And then I was thinking about the connections to unforgetting and mattering, right? And I was just thinking, in respect of Indigenous sovereignty, are there, well, two questions. First of all, are there counter-mapping exercises that are happening? Or is it, question two, are there entirely different systems of knowledge which are being produced, which have been produced over centuries, which are maybe not in the form of documents and maps, which can be drawn into this whole project of unlearning and unforgetting? So that's, I hope, a question that makes some sense.
That's a beautiful question. Thank you, Tom. Yes, of course, because all of those knowledge systems have sustained this place for several thousands of generations. So yes, there are absolutely those existing knowledge systems. They're not mine to talk about, so I don't talk about. I learn with, as you said in your introduction. What I think is important from your question, Tom, is to think about ways that if you're located as I am, as a settler, as an uninvited guest making maps like that, what is our role in creating more space and holding more space for the people who do own that knowledge to be able to craft different kinds of practices, or just practice their own practices within a system that feels like it's really already kind of contained everything within itself. Yeah, it feels like you're kind of in a hermetically sealed box, I imagine, most of the time. So I think we should look to the forms of, say, artwork. I've used lots of images here that are some of those. This one would be an excellent one, I think. I mean, I think this to me is such an important. I use this slide in virtually every presentation I do, so apologies to anyone who's ever seen me talk before. Here I am using this slide again. But it's tremendously important because it's telling us that exactly that thing. Remember. There is this other history here. There are other ways of knowing and being and doing in this place. And so I think it's incumbent on someone located like me, perhaps many of you as well, located in systems and structures like planning and design and architecture and so on, to create and hold spaces for that remembering to happen. So I think I haven't answered your question, but merely rambled a little more.
Good answer. And yeah, I need to work on my question. I didn't deliver it well, but I'm going to maybe later. Okay, so I'm going to open up for any other questions in the room, and just wait until you get the microphone in order to... and it doesn't have to be a question, right? It can be a reaction. It can be a thought that you had. It can be something of clarification. It can be sharing something from your own experience. So whatever you feel like saying in this context. This is a talkative lot, so I know there are questions and reactions. So again, it doesn't, there's no such thing as a bad question, I don't think, and there's no such thing as a reaction that isn't welcome here, right? So.
Thank you so much for your amazing talk. My question sort of prods towards contemporary liberal politics of recognition more broadly. and in general, the entryway into sort of indigeneity or claims to indigeneity by majoritarian groups, and what that is doing to Indigenous studies in the way that it's being weaponized in very different contexts. Particularly, I suppose, I'm using the example of India and Hindutva in particular, and the weaponization of indigeneity in the way that one thinks of themselves. So even though I'm so deeply committed and convinced by Indigenous scholars in settler colonial context, I've been struggling with how this new turn is not the liberal politics, but it's a fascist politics of indigeneity. So I was just wondering what your thoughts were, or whether you had sort of anything to contribute to.
That's a fantastic question. Thank you so much. I would love to learn more from your context about that. And I can't speak to it because I don't have any knowledge at all. But anything, right, can be weaponized, as we are seeing right in front of us. Anything can be weaponized, including, and in fact, I think identity politics is one of those things that has been very much weaponized, perhaps over a long period, but we're seeing that particularly now. So what I think the analysis that the idea of a liberal politics of recognition gives us, what Glenn and others' work does, gives us a framework and a language for interrogating precisely those things, and being able to deconstruct them more and show them for what they are. Glenn writes magnificently about all sorts of things, but he writes, Leanne Simpson writes in similar ways about the ways in which we might understand something that they wouldn't even call indigeneity, right? Because they would see that as much too awkward, and I would agree. But an orientation to land, home, place, and relationships of belonging that are not steeped in systems of extraction and expulsion. So what I think that does is give us the language to say, well, when expulsion, in the fascistic way that you're describing, comes into view, we can immediately call that out for what it is. I think it gives us that, or it could give us that framework. This is not at all what Coulthard says. He's talking about a different context, but I think it would give us a framework to be able to analyse that more deeply, is my initial thought. But I'd love to have more conversation with you about that.
I'm curious if you could speak to what your experience has been working with tenants on the ground who are not themselves Indigenous but are experiencing risk of displacement. Because in my own work, I'm also trying to connect present-day dispossession to these long histories of settler colonialism, but the folks who I'm working with are not Indigenous, right? And so there's
Everyone?
sort of
Wow.
there's sort of a, I don't know if tension is the right word, but a hesitation that I feel about in speaking to them and the very pressing current issues that they're describing to me, saying, but have you thought about the legacy of settler colonialism? And, you think that maybe you want to go into, co-op ownership, but maybe ownership, it feels challenging to recontextualize the question for them when that's not something that's stemming from their experience in the moment, if that makes sense. So curious if that's something you've felt or experienced as well.
Oh yes, all the time. This is a great question. I'm so glad you raised it, and also not, because I don't have an answer. This is the hardest part, I think, of the work. It's the hardest part politically for me. It's the hardest part conceptually as well. And it's the part that we might just quickly trip over into a really awful kind of hierarchy of being grievable, which I'm not trying to do here. So it's not about saying that maybe Indigenous peoples were the first peoples dispossessed and thus we have to solve that before we solve everything else. Of course not. And yet my argument might direct one's attention towards such a thing. Neither is it saying that people who are experiencing the very pointy end of a state that's basically intent on kind of killing them because it's rendered them displaceable should really care that much, really, about other forms of dispossession in a material sense. Obviously that they will care, but in a material sense, in the moment of their pain and trauma, right? And that moment extends a long time, as we know from displacement studies, right? It's not just the moment of the uprooting. It starts long before that, and it goes on and has these rippling impacts through people's social lives. And so I'm not at all saying, you know, bad tenant over there if you're not Indigenous and you're not thinking about Indigenous sovereignty. What I'm saying is that the language that we use in housing justice struggles misses this tremendously generative position from which could spring really liberatory politics of home, to coin Michele Lancioni's words, that are not grounded in the very system that makes those tenants displaceable in the first place, is kind of where I'm trying to get to. Now, the work I think that we have to do, either as researchers or educators, but also as people who I'm imagining all of you are similar, are walking alongside communities experiencing these kinds of things, is not to kind of proselytise or bring this kind of, you know, holier than thou concept to their work, but to find ways to practice it in the relationship. So we were doing that a little bit in that quote that I showed you. Oh no, I didn't show you that quote. I took it out because I thought I had too many slides. There's a slide I have in other talks that shows the acknowledgement of country, that capital C, that we always give, you know, in Australian public life now, right? Which is a very important practice of law of that place, which is to say who you are and how you connected, how do you belong there, right? It's not a tokenistic thing. It's often read as such, but it's not that. It is a practice of law from that place. So we put an acknowledgement of country on our Safe Public Housing Collective website to say we acknowledge that this site is this sort of place of this constant unhoming process that's been underway, and we tried to link together these sort of systems of oppression in more generative ways by doing so. It didn't really work in the sense that we haven't fundamentally challenged that form of kind of political praxis. But I think that there are other, you know, interesting and innovative ways that we could invent, and that are probably already underway, to find those generative moments to say, hey, if we're constantly in tenant organising or whatever, just orienting ourselves to the state to say, hey, come do some more violence and do some more extraction, then isn't that the wrong politics? Don't we all collectively want to make together a way of being at home that isn't that thing? Let's make something different. And to me, that's the kind of promise that Arnie Almer and others offers. And to work with that is, I think, the point. I hope I answered that a little bit.
Thank you so much. And I'd love to hear you comment a little bit more about pedagogy and the way in which you see the institutions in which you are engaged kind of pushing on this from a pedagogical perspective. We could argue that universities and programs like ours are complicit in that system of ruination, right? Simply by the skills and knowledge that we seek to ensure that professionals, because at the end of the day we are primarily a professional school, need in order to work in these fields. And so how does this idea of co-production of knowledge get integrated didactically into the academy and thus begin to shift practice?
It's a great question. Thank you so much. You're completely right, and we're exactly the same kind of program. So at RMIT we have 2 undergraduate programs, one of which is an accredited planning program and a master's program also accredited by the Planning Institute, and the whole purpose is to create planners, so that you can go out into the world and be practicing in the profession, and a few people like research enough to hang around in the academy and keep studying alongside us. But absolutely, our program is geared in exactly the same way. So we have this awkward pedagogical moment, I suppose, or conceptual break, I think, for students, where we start setting them up with, here's the origins and foundations of town planning, and now let's look at some theories of urban planning, and we do some urban sociology and so on and so forth, and then we go, but wait, there's more. Everything we just told you is kind of founded in this illegitimate system, and it hurts. It hurts brains, and it hurts me sometimes to try and do that work. But I think the pedagogical practice needs to mature quite a bit more. I would certainly not claim that we are anywhere close to maturing this at all. And I think it needs to mature in a few different ways. One of which is to seed critical ways of thinking about this all the way through programs, so that it isn't the case that a student, wanders through first year and then in second year kind of gets hit over the head by Libby Porter when she comes and does the guest lecture on why all of that was a pile of crap, right? That doesn't work so well. But to seed understandings all the way through the program that are not necessarily all oriented to, here is some Indigenous curriculum that we're going to kind of sprinkle through the program, right? In Australia we have this language of indigenising the curriculum, which I find deeply weird, because it sounds to me like colouring in the curriculum. It's weird. What I think we need to do is decolonise the curriculum, which is actually also about attending to the epistemological practices of our own disciplines, and asking, why do we have those categories? Unrelated to maybe Indigenous systems of knowledge, but just why do we have those categories? Holding a mirror up to ourselves and saying, what does that category do in the world? What does the category public land do in the world? Do we want it? Should we tangle with it in different ways? So I think the more pedagogically we can bring that into our professional programs, I think we can create a profession that is got sharper tools to take out into the world with it, because the practice of being in government departments and private consultancies and so on, and having to create that kind of space that we talked about just before, of holding that kind of space, is really challenging, and they'll need you need toolkits to be able to do that work. What will that practice be? What will it look like in reality when someone says the racist thing, or closes down that, oh, that's just an artwork, we don't need to think about that, that's not really knowledge, right? What Arnie Almathorpe has to say, that's not scholarship, that's not knowledge, that's just, anecdote or something. We have to have sharp political tools for those moments when those things come up, and be able to talk with them in those spaces. So I think those are some of the things I've certainly been grappling with in my own practice. Not at all resolved, certainly a work in progress. But the great question, thank you.
To continue on that thread of practice, I think the hardest part for me when thinking about decolonization is the tension between true decolonization and land back, and the sort of structural need for, ecological stewardship, for reparations, even for folks who may not be Indigenous but may have been forcibly brought over through slavery, right? And so I'm wondering whether there are alternate pathways besides just like thinking more deeply about of like way to reconcile, right, those tensions, and whether you've encountered that in your work, and yeah, some practices that you have seen.
That's a great question, thank you. I think actually there are lots of good examples around the world of these kinds of practices, and thank you for orienting us to the importance of land back within decolonial movements. It's not just it's not only a cerebral or conceptual idea, but it absolutely has to be rooted in the concept of land back, and land back meaning I understand land back to mean based on obviously the last hour of what I've just been blethering at you about, is not rooted in the kind of exchange of rights and title, but is rooted in an understanding that we're all in place, right? We're all bodies that exist in place and that move about in the world, and we have to share this world. We have to share the earth in good, generative, responsible ways. So my reading of the land back urge is a statement of ensuring that we share the space properly and share the space responsibly. And I think there's all sorts of ways that planners, designers, architects can do that kind of work, and there's really good examples of that. So in my own context, there's a couple of really interesting movements. We have a really strong pay the rent movement, which is where organisations and individuals can pay a monthly bequest to, if you like, to no, that's the wrong terminology. They hate that terminology, but I'm probably hitting some kind of word wall shortly, and I can't think of what the proper terminology is. But it is a paying of rent to occupy the space, and that money is distributed to all sorts of grassroots campaigns, right? And with that comes an obligation to an invitation to be in good relationship, to show up at things, to get involved in things. That might not be, rallies on the street or whatever, but it might be learning about your own place, taking an opportunity to sit with someone who knows a history of that place, whether that be an Indigenous person or somebody else, to learn a little bit more about that. And thus, land back becomes also a kind of invitation to join in a kind of more generative community building kind of activity. I feel like I've drifted way off your question, but I'll stop there because I can't find my way back. But maybe I'll find my way back later.
May I ask another one? It might be a bit better. Okay, than the first one I asked, which is about the radical politics of love. I remember I heard you speak about that many, many years ago, not long after we first met, and it's always stayed with me. And I'm interested in how a radical politics of love is in a way a response to trauma and historical trauma, and how the remembering is so necessary in order to achieve that radical politics of love, or at least find what that might look like. So I wonder, because obviously there were so many things that you covered, and I'd love to know from you just a bit more about I suppose a radical politics of love is about redefining relationships to land, right? Not just among people in Australia, but in anywhere that's been colonized, right? So I would love to know a little bit more about that radical politics of love and where you're going next with this, right? And how and who you are learning with in the process of finding this radical politics and how it might be taken further.
Oh, thanks, Tom. That's a lovely question. I wrote what you're referring to is a book I wrote a while ago, and I did a slightly mad thing and wrote a sort of planning theory book that ended with a chapter about love. People didn't like it. A lot of people didn't like it anyway. But it is something that has always sat with me. I'm very much inspired by the magnificent work of Bell Hooks, of course, on this, which is really where my thinking comes from on this. But also just the practice of being a person in the world, of the importance of relationships with each other and of relationships to place. If all of what we're doing is simply kind of research or practice or whatever it is around place, it's just kind of hollow. That doesn't have a beating heart, it doesn't have a soul, it doesn't have any passion in it or any sense of who it is and where it is, I don't see the point of doing it. Do you know what I mean? Like, that to me is what energises my work. So just from my perspective, there's just kind of no point turning up unless that's the thing that I'm turning up to work with. So we're very much learning with people like bell hooks. But where I'm going with this, and I'm never going there alone, I'm always going with a great community of people who are coming along with me. I'm working on some of the work that I presented to you today with these wonderful colleagues. I mentioned David and Priya. And we're tangling with the concept of dwelling, which is a term I didn't use tonight, partly because I just wanted to avoid Heidegger. I can't deal with Heidegger. He's a problem. Partly because he's a Nazi, but not only because he's a Nazi, but for various other reasons. It's just so I didn't want to go there, and I thought, I'll just get entangled in Heidegger, and we don't need that. So the idea of dwelling, to me, seems to generate a much larger, capacious kind of conversation that we might have about the loving practice of being emplaced and at home and what that means for our relationships of accountability. And so we're working with this Yurok testimony that Arnie Alma's voice came from, to think with those folk who have always practiced that in this place, to understand what that means for thinking about housing justice. So it's kind of like doing a project about housing justice on stolen Indigenous land, but not referring to Indigenous people who have been dispossessed as the only vector through which we can see them in that situation, right? So what we're trying to do is pivot away from that kind of deficit discourse, what Amy McQuire's work would teach us, presencing, and sit and orient that work as the conceptual framework for understanding who we are and where we are. And to me, that's kind of where I'm sort of going, I think. Maybe. It needs more thought, but thank you.
Last question from there.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm just wondering that when collaborating with an Indigenous organization, how do you navigate the dynamic of valuing their perspective and knowledge while also recognizing that they do not represent the entire Indigenous community? Like, just how do you balance honoring their input without generalizing it as the voice of the whole population?
That's a beautiful question, thank you. With some difficulty, it's not straightforward, but we kind of have to do that, I think, with any, group, so to speak, using scare quotes, that we work with, especially in scholarship and planning practice as well. So I don't think necessarily it's so different from collaborating with a tenancy organisation or a community group that's doing community gardening or whatever. Their worldview is not the sum total of all worldviews. But I appreciate the premise of your question, which is one that comes up a lot, which is that we put a lot of weight into an Indigenous worldview when no such thing exists. The very terminology, Indigenous, Aboriginal, First Peoples, comes from the colonial relationship. There is no such word in any of the languages, of the hundreds of languages across the continent of so-called Australia, that would signify that term, right? Because it doesn't make any sense. So we would talk of people's nations, to use awkward terminology. So the idea that there is a perspective on that makes absolutely no sense. Where I think the generative work we can do rests is actually weirdly in planning. Because in planning, we're really good, I think, we could be better, but we're really good at paying attention closely to the place, right? So in the place, like in this place, this is Wurundjeri country. So I would never phrase this as just Aboriginal land. This is Wurundjeri country where this photograph is taken. So for Wurundjeri people, they are not just a stakeholder, they are the sovereign people of this land. So their voice has a particular salience in that context, right? And then we can think about how to make the relationships out from there to all sorts of other voices, other experiences, which are hugely diverse, of course, across both First Peoples, but also refugees, migrants, settlers like myself, people experiencing deep and abiding housing, poverty and hardship, and so on. Gay and trans people who are under attack at the moment, LGBTQI community. There are all sorts of ways that we can think about our orientation to amplifying voices, but not weighting them with this expectation that they speak for everyone, but holding space for them to just be themselves.
Okay, we could go on for ages, but wow. Thank you so much, Libby, and thank you to everyone for turning up. Thank you for the people who are watching online. Yes, there's. I'm so glad this is being recorded because this is one of the most powerful things that I've heard. It really is. So thank you so much for being here, for sharing your insights, and for making us think in ways which I think anyone interested in urban planning or wanting to be a planner needs to be thinking. So thank you so much, Libby.